Bias in AI, in artificial intelligence, is a major issue, and we need to talk about it. Not as a political stance, not from the perspective of a technical audit of different platforms, but as a thinking framework. What is bias and how might it occur? And most importantly, what can users and organizations do to prevent or avoid bias in AI? Welcome to Avoiding Bias in AI. I'm David Bowman with EdAI Now. This is a recording of a live presentation that I'm giving as a webinar. If you are a newsletter subscriber, you get the invitations to the live webinars, so I hope you do that. But let's now take a look at what is bias and what can we do about it. The major problem with the potential for bias in AI is the issue of trust. If people don't feel like they can trust what the AI is providing to them, then adoption rates are going to be low, meaning they're not going to have the productivity and innovation that's made possible with AI. Trust issues affect governance and policies around AI use within organizations. It affects organizational legal exposure and the way they make decisions about not only whether they use AI, but what they use it for. So the trust issue makes the issue of bias so urgent. What might happen in many cases? Organizations that do not address this issue head on are likely going to have one of two problems. Either they're going to over rely on AI and it's not going to have sufficient oversight for safety and ethical practices. Or, on the other hand, they're going to be too resistant to it and users and organizations are going to disengage, and then we don't have the chance for the innovation and the productivity gains. Neither one of these is an acceptable solution to the issue of bias. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at a framework. We're going to look at four major topics. First, when we talk about bias in AI, what do we actually mean? What are we talking about here? And then, where does this bias come from, or this perceived bias come from? Why is it happening? Then, once we understand that, we can look at specific strategies to mitigate the potential for bias. You're never going to remove all bias because people have biases themselves, and systems have a propensity for certain types of responses. But we can mitigate it. We can reduce the likelihood and we can mitigate its effects. And that's what we're going to look at in the third section. And then finally, what are the next steps for organizations? What do we do from here? So, four things we're going to look at. First, a technical definition. What do we mean by bias? And the key words here are unwarranted fixation on a particular interpretation, assumption, or conclusion, or an idea, and too much certainty in the output or in the idea, even if it's not merited. So a simple way to say this is bias means treating an idea with more certainty or as more certain than it actually merits or than more than is justified. That's what bias is. And it applies to both the AI systems, the platforms, and to the people who use them. So on the flip side, bias doesn't mean you have a particular perspective, you have a viewpoint, you have a schema that you're applying to new information. It doesn't mean you're disagreeing with the outputs or another person. That's not bias either. And bias also doesn't mean that you just don't have enough information. Now, incomplete information can lead to bias, but not knowing enough itself is not bias. It's that unwarranted fixation or belief or certainty in an idea when in fact it doesn't merit it. It isn't justifiable and defensible. Well, with that in mind, we have to separate two things. There is actual bias, and AIs do produce bias. And there's perceived bias, the things where we look at the response and say, oh, that's bias. But is it really? So if it's actual bias, it means we can replicate it, right? It means we can trace its root cause to the system itself, right? And typically it's going to come from two places. It's going to be the prompts that we provide, which is what the humans do, or it's going to be data-driven in the way that the systems access information. So there is real bias that needs to be recognized and addressed. But there's also perceived bias as well, which when we get a response back and it conflicts with what we already have, if we say, oh, that must be wrong, that conflict feels like we're getting a biased response when really what we're having is an emotional reaction to disagreement. Or we interpret information and responses in a certain way, but that's our interpretation, not necessarily the output of the response that we're getting from AI. And sometimes it's just a matter of mismatches. I'm expecting to receive this kind of output, and I get this kind over here. Aha, AI must be biased. Well, not necessarily. It's just a matter of refining expectations. So there is bias, and we're going to look at why it happens, but there's also perceived bias, which itself is not bias, but maybe perhaps more on the user side. So let's look at that. How does real bias occur? Where does it come from? What are the processes, the traceable, replicable processes that produced lopsided or biased responses from AI? And we're going to look at it from two ways. This is the two-source model that's going to frame this whole presentation. On the AI side, we have generative factors, which is how our response is created. On the human side, we have interpretive factors, which is how do we pose our request to AI and how do we reflect upon and interpret the response that we get. And both of these can produce or reveal bias. So let's start with the AI side here. So when AIs generate a response, there's a couple of parameters under which they operate, and these are going to give us the clues for mitigating or addressing them. But first and foremost, responses are what we call optimized for likelihood. What do most people think? What do most people want? What kind of a response is going to satisfy most people, most commonly? And the response is going to come from there. We have a part of that is the majority views and that central tendency, which I'll explain all these. But there's also the issue of safe phrasing, avoiding potential conflict, and the attempt to please the user and do what the user asks. So central tendency, or the averaging effect, basically looks like this. There's a lot of information, but what is the most common information, whether it's the thing that people generally expect or the most likely information within the training data, the data information, and what is going to fit the average? So when we talk about averaging, what is most of the information saying? And that's what it's going to give us. And it may skip divergent or minority views as a result because it's looking for that typical and safe output. For example, if we say, explain the causes of rising housing costs, the most common responses, the most common information has to do with things like supply and demand. But there could be other information also which is just not well represented in the data or in the information. Things like economic accessibility to housing or the effective regulation. So these are lesser known or more minority inputs to a decision, but the AI might skip them because it's going to go for the big, most common factors, which is here supply and constraints. So what we get is we say, wow, this leaves out a lot of considerations in this response here. Therefore, it's biased. Well, in a certain degree it is because it's trying to please the most people possible. And sometimes the information is just not there. Or we prompt in such a way that focuses the AI's response on a subset of all the available information. So that's what it's going to respond using. And there may be other information, or there might be gaps in the information that the AI doesn't have access to. So it can't use it for its response. It's only going to look at a set of all the possibilities and all the possible information. So if we say explain changes in graduation rates, we're going to get what is in the training data, or what's available on the web, because platforms can now go out and search the web and get new information. I often ask for that. Give me information from the last 5 years or something like that. But there could be other information that's skipped because it's not accessible to the AI, such as demographic shifts or reporting adjustments. Or if we're trying to use AI for a very specialized context, that information just might not be there. And as a result, the response is incomplete. And we say, oh, therefore, there's a bias towards information that's available and information to which we have directed it. And then just thinking about how AIs generate the response, they have what's called a token. They've got a few words or a phrase or something. And then based on that, what are the most likely follow-ups to it? What's the most likely next word or next token? Well, in 90% of the case, it may be a certain response or a certain word is next, and that will drive the AI off to go and continue that thought. But it could choose something that's only represented or only 1% likely, right? It's a curve. It's probably going to do the 90%, but if it grabs the 1%, it's going to take the AI off into a different direction. So next token prediction itself can lead to a skewed response. And there's just the fact that AIs are people pleasers. They're going to try to do what you ask them to do to the best of their ability. So if you ask it to do something, it's going to do that. Well, it may not do other things. It may leave a lot of possibilities out, and as a result, you get a lopsided response. So if I were to ask the AI, "Dear Bob, explain how social media harms adolescent mental health." Okay, so I'm going to get the most common, the most common possibilities, the best research, all that kind of stuff. And it's going to do that. It's going to tell me, here's how social media harms adolescent mental health. But it's not going to do some other things, like, is it a big problem? What's the magnitude of this problem? Or what are the causes? Or are there any alternate perspectives on this or conflicting ideas? Because I haven't asked for them. And it's going to try to please me by doing what I asked. So AIs are people pleasers, right? And they're probably not likely or not naturally, because of their constraints in their design, to do things outside of what we have asked them to do. Well, that gives us a bridge to looking at the human side, right? Because that's how AIs work that can produce seemingly biased responses. On the human side, however, there are 4 major ways that humans bring bias to AI. Automation confidence, mistaking confirmation for correctness, treating disagreements as bias, and those are all epistemic biases, which means the idea that certain information is complete, final, and definitive. So the automation bias is simply this. Because the AI does something fast and looks fancy and it's well written and all that kind of stuff, there's an assumption that therefore it must be correct. As if the AI is the definitive final answer, as opposed to considering the possibility that there are other ideas. So that's the first epistemic error. The second epistemic error is assuming that you are correct, that you know everything, and that your ideas and your values are facts and so forth. So if you get agreement from the AI, you assume, it must be correct because it agrees with me, assuming you have the definitive information. So anything that agrees with you must be correct. But then on the flip side of that is, what if the AI disagrees? If you are having that epistemic error, I know everything and I have the final answer, then if you get a response that contradicts it, you therefore assume it must be biased. Well, the interesting thing is, and I'm going to back up one here, it's actually pretty easy to have AI agree with you. If you only ask for supporting information about an idea, you're only going to get supporting information. If you only ask for a critique of opposing views, you're only going to get a critique of opposing views. And these are the things that we do to make AI agree with us. And if we're not careful, we're going to assume that it is in fact correct when it might not be, or it might not be complete. Those are epistemic errors. But there's another one also that we're going to get to in a minute, which is more about the interpretation side. But to round this out, the core idea of an epistemic error means knowledge is fixed and complete. And so on one side, we think if it's AI, it must be correct. On the opposite side, if we disagree with it, it must be biased, right? And if it agrees with us, then it must be right. All of those are biases, right? They're all epistemic errors. But on the human side, we can provoke that, as I showed with how do we get the AI to agree with us? Sometimes the prompts, the information, the instructions we give to the AI itself produces bias. If you have a particular belief or an assumption, and you frame your prompt, your instructions to the AI in the chat box, based on your biases and assumptions, then you're going to get something that reflects those biases and assumptions. If you put in bias, you're going to get bias out. That is a metacognitive error, which is understanding how are you thinking and what are you thinking about and what is your thinking process and reflecting on what you're thinking, right? Understanding the biases and being able to recognize your own within the prompting process is how we get around that. We're going to talk more about that, but that's a metacognitive error. It's understanding what's happening in your own noggin. So what does that mean? So those types of interpretive or metacognitive biases could be hidden assumptions. It could be the way you frame the request. It could be what you leave out of the request as well. So, for example, if you say, why did this policy fail? You are assuming it failed or that there's a singular answer. Explain how this causes that. Well, maybe it's a correlation and not causality, but you are making the assumption that it is, in fact, causal, and the AI will try to explain that for you. Or, how can I deal with this troublemaker? Well, maybe that person isn't a troublemaker. Maybe there are factors that are involved in that particular context, which you are overlooking. Okay, or defend the view. All right. So those are all metacognitive errors. So now that we've looked at where bias comes from, or presumed bias, from the AI side and from the user side, now we have some clues about how can we prevent it, or how can we reduce its effect or its likelihood. How can we prevent it? So mitigating, and we're going to look at both sides. We're going to look at the AI side, and what we're going to see are strategies reflecting your own personal judgment and the need for personal judgment. And then we're going to jailbreak AI. The term jailbreaking specifically means getting the AI to respond in such a way that is outside of its normal processes, right? It's designed to respond this way, and we're going to do some things to force it to respond differently. We're going to jailbreak it. But we're going to do the same thing for the human side also. We're going to look at metacognitive factors and, in the same way, jailbreak your brain. So let's start with AI bias. And as I said, it's professional judgment and jailbreaking. So let's look at both of those. So when you get a response from AI, you have the professional responsibility to apply your judgment, to be skeptical, to evaluate the response, to ensure that constraints of your particular domain, your expertise, your field of study, your context for using AI is appropriately represented within the response, and simply to reflect upon what you've got and see what you need to do next. So we don't ever treat the AI response as a final output. What we treat it as an input in a larger thinking process. You still have work to do after the AI responds. And that might include you need to add more context. You need to iterate or add information or change the prompt. You need to redirect the information that's being drawn from. You need to provide metrics. Success looks like this. A successful response is this. A bad response is that, right? And jailbreaking, which is what we're going to do now. So here are some examples of how we can get the AI to operate outside of its normal parameters, right? It's basically, if we know how it works with the averaging and the norming and the people pleasing and all of that, we are specifically going to ask it to respond differently. So instead of giving me the most common perspective on a particular issue, present me with multiple credible perspectives, including areas of disagreement and areas of uncertainty, which it won't naturally do because it's not designed to do that. So we ask for it. Explain the trade-offs involved in different positions. Don't give me a single optimized conclusion. Give me multiple possibilities and tell me about the trade-offs, the pros and cons of each one. Something that I always do, give me your level of confidence in your response. If it's going to drop below 95 or 90%, I know I need to look at the output very carefully. And instead of saying, give me a single approach, give me multiple and organize them into various categories of schools of thought. All right. So we are specifically instructing the AI, don't average, don't please me, don't give me the most common. Go out and give me a broader, more comprehensive response. We're jailbreaking the AI. Now, on the human side, so on the AI side, it's your professional judgment and some of those strategies to make the AI operate differently. But on the human side, it's metacognition. It's thinking about what's happening in your brain while you're using AI, and then getting your brain to think a little bit differently, jailbreaking your own brain. So when we are using AI, we need to always check our metacognition. We need to check our thinking, right? We need to specify, what am I thinking? What am I assuming with this? How am I putting myself into my prompt or into my interpretation of the output? We need to stress test it, which is to say, if this response is wrong, what would make it wrong, right? And what could the result be? And what other information is possible? I have an idea. Are there other ideas that I need to consider as well? Or am I inappropriately restricting my ideas to a limited set that makes me feel good or that fits with my experience and so forth? How much certainty do I need with this? Does it even matter, right? And when we're prompting, of course, why are we prompting? What are we trying to do? Are we trying to get information or are we trying to confirm information? So we have to think about our intent as well. And we always have to be humble, quite honestly. Do I know everything? And if I look at this response that maybe disagrees with me or is different than I expected, does it have merit? And am I willing to accept that possibility? So with that, we can turn to AI for help with that as well. And we can just ask the AI, here's here are my ideas, and I'm looking for information about them and so forth. But what I want you to do, Bob, is identify any assumptions that I might be including in my question and explain how they have influenced the response, right? Sometimes we don't see our own assumptions. We need that external source so we can ask for it. We ask the AI, do you see any assumptions or presumptions or potential bias in what I'm asking for? And if so, let me know about it. And this is one that I do a lot. Here are my ideas. I'm thinking about this and I'm thinking about that. I want this to happen. Am I missing anything? Does it make sense? I want those feedback on my own ideas so as I move forward, I don't end up with a lopsided or biased response. What other approaches can I consider? And these are all things that we're asking the AI to do. Here are my ideas. Critique them. Don't tell me I'm wonderful. Critique it, right? I already know I'm wonderful. What I need to know is become more wonderful. So tell me where I'm going wrong and where I'm going right. And when we get responses back, tell me, how does it align with these other ideas that I already have, so forth. So we can use the AI to help overcome some of those metacognitive difficulties, errors. So what is our responsibility? Well, if we take all of this, the user has 3 responsibilities. We have to be able to question ourselves. We have to think critically about how we are interacting with the AI as we're prompting and as we're collaborating with the AI. And we always have to have a healthy skepticism of what we get back and what we're putting in and how we're interpreting. And that's healthy to do. It leads to better, more useful results. So, 2 overall strategies. All this said, when we're prompting, think about what you're putting in. Why are you prompting? What are you trying to accomplish? And then when we get the results back, we don't treat them as final results. We treat them as an input into an ongoing process here. From the organizational standpoint, what do we need to do? Where do we go next? Well, organizations have 6 primary responsibilities because this is an organization-wide issue. We have to have shared definitions, right? When we're talking about bias and acceptable outputs and so on, what do we mean by that? And there has to be some uniformity across the organization. Normalizing structured prompting, which is, here are ways you can prompt, and here are some accepted prompts that have been tested, for bias and for productivity and usefulness and so forth. This one's a tough one. Supporting epistemic humility. It's a hard thing to tell people. It's okay if you don't know everything. It's okay to be wrong. Let's learn and figure it out. And that is something which directly comes from the organizational leadership. When they say, I just want the fastest, best, right answer every single time or you're in trouble, right? You're not a good employee. No. We have to be able to embrace epistemic humility because that is how we grow and learn and make progress. For high-stakes decision-making, we have to review the outputs and we have to review the prompts as well. If the stakes are important and the risks are high, it shouldn't be just one person by himself. Let's review, like we would for any kind of high-stakes product within an organization. We have to have a way to report potential bias and report bias processes as well. There has to be some kind of a hierarchy that says, I'm not sure about this. It doesn't look right to me. Where do I go with it for additional input and review? And most importantly, and this is sort of the nutshell, organizations need to provide professional learning opportunities for their members so that we can mitigate and we can understand and we can avoid and we can address bias. We're not going to get rid of all of it. It's always going to be there, but we can help people to understand what it is and what can we do about it. So 3 main things. If we're looking at professional learning, which I think is absolutely essential, What is what is how does AI work, basically? The understanding the conceptual basis of AI. What are the cognitive skills, the professional judgment skills that people need to apply? And then how do we embed the use of AI into our workflows? In most cases, most professional learning is just that third piece. Here's stuff you can do. But we also have to deal with the understanding and the thinking skills so that when we use it, we are using it safely, ethically, and productively to accomplish meaningful purposes. And when we do that, trust goes up. People begin to use it. The policies are in alignment with practice. Legal exposure and challenges go down. And the kinds of decisions we can make through using AI are going to go up. So here's the final takeaway on this whole long discussion. Bias isn't just a matter of what the AI does. Bias is an issue of failing to question whether we're an individual or an organization. Question ourselves and question our interaction with AI. So there you go. Bias and avoiding bias. Again, I am David Bowman with EdAI Now. This is a recording of the full presentation delivered as a live webinar. If you want to be included in the live webinars, make sure that you subscribe to our newsletter. Last month was great, differentiating reading for student access and using AI to do that. Next month, we're going to be looking at learning centers within the education learning environment. But this one is such a big topic, we had to take it straight on, because if we can't deal with bias, then people may not be willing to innovate and use the AI to accomplish their purposes. So thank you very much for being here. I appreciate you. You're always welcome to contact us for training, for resources, information. Check out the website. There is a lot of information and a lot of freely available resources for you there. I hope you found this useful. Take care.